The black Rolls-Royce arrived at exactly 8:17 p.m., just as Jason Carter lifted a champagne glass to introduce his 26-year-old fiancée to the entire reunion. Rain shimmered against the towering windows of the Grandview Country Club, turning the city lights outside into blurred ribbons of gold and silver. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers glowed over polished marble floors and clusters of former classmates pretending they had not spent the last 15 years measuring one another's success. Expensive perfume mixed with the scent of bourbon and fresh roses while a jazz trio played softly near the stage. Their music nearly drowned beneath the steady hum of laughter and curated nostalgia. Jason Carter thrived in rooms like this. He always had. Even at 17, he had carried himself like someone destined to be admired. Tonight was no different. His tailored navy tuxedo fit perfectly across his broad shoulders, his silver watch catching the chandelier light each time he raised his hand to touch Chloe Bennett's waist. Chloe leaned against him with effortless confidence, her sleek blonde hair falling over the crimson silk dress that turned heads every time she crossed the ballroom. She was beautiful in the sharp, deliberate way social media had taught people to become beautiful. Younger than most women in the room by nearly a decade, she smiled like the entire evening existed solely to photograph her from the right angle. "Babe," she whispered, brushing invisible lint from Jason's lapel. "Which one was your ex-wife again?" Jason smirked before taking another sip of whiskey. "You'll know if she shows up," he said casually. Eleanor always looked uncomfortable in places like this. A few people nearby laughed too quickly, eager to stay on the winning side of the conversation. Jason noticed it and relaxed further into the attention. That was the thing about reunions. They were less about reconnecting and more about proving who had won. And tonight, Jason intended to win loudly. "I still can't believe she actually left Chicago after the divorce," one former classmate muttered. "Honestly," another replied, "I heard she disappeared completely." Jason shrugged with practiced indifference, though the tightening in his jaw betrayed him for half a second. "Some people just can't keep up," he said. "Life moves fast." Chloe squeezed his arm proudly, her engagement ring flashing beneath the chandelier lights. Across the ballroom, someone dimmed the music slightly as more guests filtered inside from the rain. Coat attendants hurried near the entrance while waiters floated through the crowd carrying champagne flutes on silver trays. Then it happened. The low murmur inside the ballroom shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, just enough for people closest to the windows to glance outside. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom had pulled beneath the covered entrance, its glossy finish reflecting rainwater like liquid obsidian. The driver stepped out first, holding a large black umbrella against the storm. Conversations slowed one by one, rippling quietly across the ballroom. Jason barely noticed at first. He was in the middle of telling a story about a new real estate acquisition in Scottsdale when Chloe lightly touched his wrist. "Jason," she whispered. "Someone important just arrived." He turned lazily toward the entrance, expecting another wealthy donor or former athlete looking older than everyone remembered. Instead, the ballroom doors opened slowly, and a woman stepped inside wearing champagne-colored silk beneath a long, ivory cashmere coat. For one suspended second, nobody recognized her. Then the room went still. Eleanor Hayes removed her gloves carefully, rainwater glimmering along the soft waves of her chestnut hair. The years had changed her in the quietest possible way. She no longer looked like someone asking permission to exist. Her posture was effortless now, her expression calm, unreadable. Diamond earrings caught the light when she turned her head slightly toward the ballroom, and suddenly Jason felt something cold settle heavily beneath his ribs. Chloe blinked in confusion. "Wait," she said softly. "That's Eleanor?" But Jason couldn't answer. Because standing there beneath the chandelier glow, with rain still clinging to the hem of her silk dress, and half the room staring speechlessly at her arrival, Eleanor Hayes no longer looked like the woman he had left behind. She looked like someone who had returned for a reason. The silence lasted only 3 seconds, but inside the Grandview Country Club ballroom, it felt much longer. Eleanor Hayes stood beneath the chandelier light with one gloved hand resting lightly against the strap of her evening bag, while rainwater shimmered like tiny diamonds along the sleeve of her ivory coat. Conversations that had once filled the room with easy laughter now dissolved into whispers so soft they sounded almost embarrassed. Jason Carter stared at her as if his mind could not rearrange the woman in front of him with the memory he still carried. Because the Eleanor he remembered had always tried to make herself smaller, softer, easier to manage. This woman did not. "Oh my God," someone near the bar muttered quietly. "She looks incredible." Chloe Bennett shifted uncomfortably beside Jason, the confidence in her posture tightening by the second. She had spent the last hour enjoying the attention that naturally followed beauty and youth, but now the room had tilted away from her without warning. Eleanor was not louder than anyone else in the ballroom. She was not trying harder. That was exactly what made people stare. The code attendant approached Eleanor quickly, almost nervously, accepting her cashmere coat with both hands as though he recognized something important before everyone else did. Beneath it, her champagne silk dress moved like liquid gold under the chandelier glow, elegant without demanding attention. "Old money energy," one former classmate whispered under her breath. Eleanor smiled politely at the woman nearest the entrance before stepping fully into the ballroom. Her heels crossed the marble floor with quiet precision, and Jason suddenly remembered another sound entirely: the soft creak of hardwood floors in their first apartment downtown. Sunday mornings when Eleanor would walk barefoot into the kitchen carrying coffee in oversized sweaters while rain tapped gently against the windows. Back then, she used to laugh more easily. Before he taught her to question every part of herself. "Jason," Chloe's voice snapped him back. "Are you okay?" He swallowed hard and straightened his shoulders immediately. "Of course," he replied too quickly, but his whiskey glass remained frozen near his chest. Across the room, Eleanor greeted Jessica Monroe with a warm embrace. Jessica had been one of the few people who stayed beside Eleanor after the divorce, when gossip spread faster than truth, and nearly everyone chose Jason's version of the story because it sounded cleaner, easier, more glamorous. Jason had always known how to control narratives. "You did not tell me she was going to look like that," Chloe whispered sharply, forcing a smile for nearby guests. Jason exhaled slowly through his nose. "She used to care more," he muttered. But even to his own ears, the sentence sounded weak. Because the truth was impossible to ignore. Eleanor did not look like a woman trying to prove anything tonight. She looked like someone who no longer needed approval from anyone in the room. That realization unsettled him more than anger ever could. Near the ballroom stage, Eleanor accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter. Her fingers curled delicately around the crystal stem while she listened to Jessica speak, nodding softly, smiling once. She never glanced toward Jason. Not once. And somehow that hurt his ego more than if she had slapped him across the face. Around them, old classmates continued stealing glances toward Eleanor between conversations. Men who had barely noticed her years ago suddenly stood taller when she passed. Women who once pitied her divorce now studied her with quiet curiosity. The room had begun rearranging itself around her presence without her saying more than a handful of words. Chloe noticed it too. "You said she disappeared," Chloe said carefully. "She did." Jason loosened his bow tie slightly, though the ballroom was not warm. His pulse had begun beating strangely beneath his collarbone. Because deep down, beneath the expensive suit and rehearsed confidence, he understood something horrifying in that moment. Eleanor Hayes had not disappeared after the divorce. She had simply rebuilt herself somewhere beyond his reach. Jason Carter had spent most of his life believing charm could control any room. Back in high school, people used to orbit him naturally, drawn toward the easy confidence, the varsity jackets, the loud laughter that carried through crowded hallways like he already belonged to a bigger world. Teachers praised him. Coaches protected him. Girls admired him. And beside him, almost every single day, stood Eleanor Hayes. At 17, Eleanor had been nothing like the woman now standing beneath the crystal lights of the Grandview Ballroom. She had been softer then, quieter, the kind of girl who wore oversized sweaters during October football games and spent lunch breaks sketching old buildings in the margins of her notebooks. While Jason chased attention, Eleanor noticed details. Rain on classroom windows, dust floating through library sunlight, the way people changed their voices depending on who was listening. She had loved Jason long before he understood what to do with that kind of devotion. "Remember prom?" One former classmate suddenly laughed near the bar. Jason and Eleanor were basically high school royalty. The comment drifted across the ballroom and landed somewhere sharp inside Jason's chest. Chloe smiled politely without understanding the history beneath those words. She only knew the polished version of Jason Carter, the successful real estate developer with luxury condos in Scottsdale and Miami, the man who ordered 18-year whiskey without looking at prices. She had never seen the younger Jason, the boy who once drove Eleanor home in a dented pickup truck after late-night diner shifts because neither of them had money for anything better. Across the ballroom, Eleanor tilted her head slightly as Jessica showed her old reunion photos displayed near the stage. A faint smile touched her lips, though it looked distant somehow, like she was remembering someone else's life. Jason stared longer than he meant to. There had been a time when Eleanor looked at him like he hung the moon itself above her world. He used to love that feeling. At first, then slowly, almost invisibly, he began needing more. More success, more admiration, more proof that he was becoming someone important. And somewhere during those years, Eleanor stopped feeling like a partner and started feeling too quiet for the life he imagined he deserved. "You know," one man muttered beside Jason, "I always thought you two would end up together forever." Jason forced a laugh. People change. But the words tasted hollow. Because the truth was more complicated than that. Eleanor had not changed overnight. He had simply stopped seeing her clearly. The first few years of marriage had been good, or at least they looked good from the outside. Rooftop dinners in Chicago, weekend trips to Napa Valley, expensive apartments with floor-to-ceiling windows and marble kitchens that always photographed beautifully online. Jason built a career selling luxury lifestyles while Eleanor quietly arranged every detail behind the scenes. She hosted clients, remembered birthdays, smoothed over awkward conversations after too many cocktails. She made his life feel effortless, and Jason, slowly intoxicated by his own ambition, began treating that effortlessness as something ordinary, something guaranteed. "Jason," Chloe's manicured fingers touched his arm again. "Why are you staring at her?" He blinked hard. Across the ballroom, Eleanor laughed softly at something Jessica said, the sound almost swallowed by the jazz music drifting through the room. Jason realized then that he had not heard Eleanor laugh like that in years. Not during the final months of their marriage. Back then, their penthouse had felt cold no matter how expensive it became. Every conversation turned practical, transactional. Eleanor would ask if he was coming home for dinner. Jason would answer while checking emails. She would suggest taking a weekend off together. He would call her unrealistic, too emotional, too needy. Eventually, she stopped asking for things altogether. And somehow, at the time, Jason had mistaken her silence for weakness instead of heartbreak. Near the ballroom entrance, another burst of rain rattled softly against the glass windows while waiters refreshed champagne trays beneath the chandeliers. The room still revolved quietly around Eleanor's presence, and Jason hated how little control he suddenly felt over any of it. Because for the first time in years, he was beginning to understand something deeply unsettling. The woman he once dismissed as forgettable had become unforgettable the moment she stopped belonging to him. By 9 o'clock, the reunion had divided itself into invisible circles of power the way rooms like this always did. Former athletes clustered near the whiskey bar comparing investment portfolios. Couples with polished smiles discussed private schools and vacation homes in Aspen. Women in tailored dresses exchanged compliments sharp enough to cut glass beneath their sweetness. And through it all, Eleanor Hayes moved calmly between conversations like someone entirely untouched by the desperate performance surrounding her. Jason Carter hated how much everyone watched her. He hated it even more because she seemed unaware of it. Or worse, above it. Chloe noticed the shift in attention too. She laughed louder now, touched Jason more often, tilted her engagement ring toward the chandelier light every chance she got. But the room kept drifting back toward Eleanor like a compass searching for north. "You should go say hello," Chloe said finally, her smile tightening around the edges. Jason swirled the amber liquid in his glass without answering. "Why would I do that?" "Because everyone is staring at you like you saw a ghost." He forced a smirk. "Trust me, Eleanor is not a ghost." But even as he said it, his chest felt strangely hollow. Across the ballroom, Eleanor stood near a massive marble fireplace, speaking with an older couple from their graduating class. The firelight softened the delicate lines of her face while gold reflections danced across the champagne silk of her dress. Jason remembered buying her a dress almost that exact color years ago for a charity dinner in Chicago. She had stood in front of the bedroom mirror, quietly asking if it was too much. He had barely looked up from his phone before saying, "Try not to overdress. These events are about business." The memory arrived so suddenly it made him uncomfortable. Because tonight, Eleanor was overdressed for nothing. She was not trying to impress anyone, and somehow that made her impossible to ignore. "Jason," a booming voice, interrupted his thoughts. Derek Holloway slapped him on the shoulder with the kind of forced enthusiasm men used when alcohol blurred the difference between friendship and competition. "Man, you hit the jackpot with this one." Derek laughed, nodding toward Chloe. "Definitely upgraded." Chloe smiled instantly, leaning into Jason's side. Jason gave a small nod, but before he could answer, Derek glanced across the room and let out a low whistle. "Although," he added carefully, "your ex-wife looks like she stepped out of a magazine tonight." The silence that followed tightened like a wire. Chloe's smile flickered. Jason's jaw hardened almost invisibly. Derek laughed awkwardly and took another sip of bourbon. "I mean, seriously, nobody expected that." Jason finally straightened his shoulders and forced the easy confidence that used to come naturally. "Eleanor always liked dramatic entrances," he said casually. "It is nice to see she is doing okay." But the sentence landed wrong the second it left his mouth. Too rehearsed. Too cold. Chloe glanced at him carefully, sensing the shift beneath his polished tone. Across the ballroom, Eleanor turned slightly as another former classmate approached her. Her expression remained warm but reserved, as though she had learned exactly how much of herself to give people. Jason suddenly remembered the final year of their marriage with painful clarity. Eleanor sitting alone at their 12-seat dining table while his dinner grew cold because another client meeting had run late. Eleanor asking softly if he still loved her while he answered without looking up from his laptop. "Why do you always make everything emotional?" He used to think ambition justified everything. Long hours. Missed anniversaries. The constant criticism. He convinced himself Eleanor was simply too sensitive for the world he wanted. Then Chloe arrived like a spotlight wrapped inside a red dress. Young. Exciting. Effortless. She laughed at his jokes. Admired his success. Never questioned him. At least not in the beginning. Jason had mistaken admiration for compatibility. And now, standing beneath the chandeliers while Eleanor calmly held an entire ballroom captive. Without demanding a second of attention, he felt something unfamiliar creep slowly beneath his skin. Regret. Near the ballroom entrance, thunder rolled softly beyond the rain-streaked windows. Eleanor lifted her sparkling water to her lips, listening politely as someone spoke to her. Then suddenly her eyes shifted across the room, directly toward Jason. The noise of the ballroom seemed to disappear all at once. She did not smile. She did not look angry. Her gaze simply rested on him with the calm detachment of someone observing a chapter she had already finished reading. Then, after a single unbearable second, Eleanor looked away first. And somehow that hurt him more than hatred ever could. The rest of the ballroom recovered slowly after that glance between Jason and Eleanor, but the atmosphere had changed in a way nobody could fully explain. Conversations continued. Music drifted softly through the crystal-lit room. Champagne glasses clinked against polished marble countertops. Yet underneath it all ran a quiet tension sharp enough to feel against the skin. Eleanor Hayes had become the center of gravity without ever trying to claim it. Jason hated how effortlessly she carried herself now. More than once, he caught people turning toward her while pretending not to. Men adjusted their jackets before approaching her. Women softened their voices when speaking to her. Even the event staff seemed strangely attentive whenever she crossed the ballroom. It unsettled him because Eleanor used to disappear in rooms like this. Back then, she would stay close to him, smiling politely while he dominated conversations with clients and investors. He used to think that made him stronger. Tonight, watching her move through the reunion alone with complete ease, he realized how much of her quietness had once been caution. "I need another drink," Chloe muttered suddenly. Jason barely heard her. His eyes stayed fixed across the ballroom where Eleanor now stood beside a tall window overlooking the rain-soaked golf course outside. The storm had intensified, silver streaks sliding down the glass while distant lightning illuminated the clouds beyond the hills. Eleanor looked calm against that backdrop, almost cinematic beneath the chandelier glow. Chloe returned moments later carrying 2 champagne flutes. "You are being weird tonight," she said carefully, handing him one. "I thought you said the divorce was years ago." Jason took the glass without drinking. "It was." "Then why do you look nervous every time someone talks to her?" His expression hardened immediately. "I am not nervous." Chloe studied him for a second longer before forcing a bright smile as another couple approached them. But the insecurity remained behind her eyes now. She had arrived tonight expecting to be admired beside a successful man with a glamorous future. Instead, she was beginning to feel like an accessory in someone else's unfinished story. Near the stage, the reunion organizer tapped lightly against a microphone. "All right, everyone," she laughed warmly. "We are about to start the alumni slideshow, so please grab your seats." A wave of movement swept through the ballroom as people drifted toward candlelit tables arranged around the dance floor. Jason automatically reached for Chloe's hand, but his attention snagged again on Eleanor. Jessica guided her toward a nearby table near the front. Empty seat beside her. Jason's pulse quickened before he could stop it. Then Derek Holloway grinned mischievously beside him. "You should sit with your ex-wife for old times' sake." A few people nearby chuckled. Jason forced a confident laugh. "I think Eleanor has survived enough old times." The joke landed unevenly. Chloe crossed her arms. "You talk about her like she is the villain." Jason opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. Because suddenly he remembered the night Eleanor finally left. Not screaming, not crying, just standing quietly in the middle of their penthouse living room while Chicago snow drifted outside the windows. She had looked exhausted more than angry, like someone carrying a weight too heavy for too long. "I do not recognize myself anymore," she had whispered. He remembered barely reacting at all. He had been too distracted by contracts, deadlines, Chloe's constant texts lighting up his phone screen. Eleanor had waited several seconds after speaking, almost as if hoping he would stop her. He never did. Looking back now, Jason realized something deeply humiliating. He had spent years convincing himself Eleanor left because she was weak. But weak people did not walk away from lives they built with their own hands. Weak people stayed because leaving required courage. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the slideshow flickered onto giant screens near the stage. Old yearbook photos appeared one after another while laughter echoed through the room. Teenagers frozen in time. Football games. Pep rallies. Prom nights. Then suddenly, there they were. Jason and Eleanor at 18 years old, standing together beneath cheap gold decorations at senior prom. Eleanor's smile in the photograph looked radiant and unguarded, her hand resting lightly against Jason's chest while he grinned proudly at the camera like the future already belonged to him. The room let out a collective sigh of nostalgia. Jason stared at the image longer than anyone else. Because somewhere between that photograph and this ballroom tonight, he had lost the one person who used to look at him like he was enough before the world taught him to demand more. The applause that followed the slideshow faded slowly beneath the soft hum of jazz music and low conversation. But Jason Carter could not stop staring at the photograph that had disappeared from the screen seconds earlier. 18-year-old Eleanor smiling up at him with complete trust in her eyes. Back then, he used to think that kind of love would always be there waiting for him no matter how carelessly he treated it. The realization settled heavily in his chest while candlelight flickered across the ballroom tables. Chloe leaned closer beside him, her perfume sharp with vanilla and expensive florals. "It is just old pictures," she whispered lightly. "You are acting like somebody died." Jason forced a laugh under his breath, but something about the comment unsettled him more than it should have. Because in some ways, somebody had died. The version of Eleanor who once built her entire world around him no longer existed. Across the ballroom, Eleanor sat gracefully beside Jessica Monroe while former classmates rotated through conversations at her table. She listened more than she spoke, smiled softly at the right moments. Her elegance felt natural now, not practiced. Jason remembered when she used to overthink every social event during their marriage. Before charity galas in Chicago, she would stand in front of their bedroom mirror quietly adjusting earrings while asking him if she looked appropriate enough for his clients. Jason rarely answered properly. Most nights, he barely looked up from his phone. "We're the black one," he would mutter while typing emails. "And try not to talk politics with investors." At the time, he convinced himself he was helping her fit into his world. In reality, He had spent years teaching Eleanor that her instincts were somehow embarrassing, too emotional, too sincere, too much. The slow collapse of their marriage had not happened in one explosive moment. It happened quietly, through hundreds of tiny dismissals that accumulated like cracks beneath expensive marble floors. Jason missed dinners, ignored conversations, rolled his eyes when Eleanor tried explaining how lonely she felt in the penthouse while he traveled constantly for work. "You have everything people dream about," he told her once after a fundraiser in downtown Chicago. "What exactly are you unhappy about?" He still remembered the silence that followed. Eleanor had stood barefoot near the massive kitchen island wearing one of his old sweaters, her wine glass untouched beside her. Snow drifted gently beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows while the city lights reflected across polished black marble. "I miss my husband," she whispered. Jason had sighed heavily back then, irritated more than concerned. "You are being dramatic." The memory hit him now with sickening clarity. Because Eleanor had not wanted luxury. She wanted presence, attention, partnership, things he stopped offering long before the marriage officially ended. Nearby, Derek Holloway laughed loudly at another table while old classmates ordered more drinks from passing waiters. The reunion had relaxed again on the surface, but Jason still felt strangely disconnected from the room. His focus kept drifting toward Eleanor, no matter how hard he tried to resist it. Did she always dress like that? Chloe asked suddenly, staring across the ballroom. Jason frowned slightly. Like what? Elegant. The word lingered between them awkwardly. Jason looked back toward Eleanor. Her champagne silk dress caught the chandelier light every time she moved, subtle and expensive without appearing flashy. There was confidence in the way she carried herself now. Not arrogance. Not revenge. Something quieter and far more intimidating. Peace. Jason realized with growing discomfort that he had never truly seen Eleanor during their marriage because he spent too much time trying to reshape her into someone else. Someone louder, more polished, more useful to his ambitions. Then came Chloe. Young, ambitious, constantly admiring him. At first, the attention felt intoxicating. Chloe laughed at every joke, posted glamorous photos from rooftop bars and private events. She made Jason feel powerful in public ways Eleanor never tried to. By the time the affair became obvious, Jason had already rewritten the story inside his own head. Eleanor was holding him back. Chloe understood him better. The divorce became another business decision disguised as emotional honesty. Efficient, clean, necessary. At least that was what he told himself. But now, watching Eleanor laugh softly at something Jessica whispered beside her, Jason felt the terrifying weight of a possibility he had spent years avoiding. Maybe Eleanor had never been the problem. Maybe the problem was that he only valued things once other people started admiring them too. By the time dessert trays began circulating through the ballroom, the storm outside had deepened into a steady curtain of rain that blurred the golf course lights beyond the windows. Inside the Grandview Country Club, warmth and luxury wrapped around the reunion like a carefully staged illusion. Crystal candle holders flickered across white linen tables. Waiters in black jackets carried slices of chocolate torte and champagne refills through clusters of former classmates reliving polished versions of their younger selves. But Jason Carter could not escape the growing pressure tightening beneath his ribs every time his eyes found Eleanor haze across the room. She had not approached him once all evening. That should have relieved him. Instead, it unsettled him more deeply than confrontation would have. Because Eleanor no longer seemed interested in proving anything to him. And somehow, that made him feel invisible. "You are doing it again," Chloe said quietly beside him. Jason blinked. "Doing what?" "Looking at her like you forgot I am sitting here." Her tone remained light enough to avoid drawing attention, but he caught the sharpness beneath it immediately. Jason exhaled slowly and reached for his champagne glass. "You are imagining things." Chloe gave a small laugh that sounded more defensive than amused. "Am I?" Across the ballroom, Eleanor stood near the piano speaking to an older couple Jason vaguely recognized from their graduating class. She listened with full attention when people spoke to her. That was something he used to love about her before he started dismissing it as softness. Eleanor made people feel heard, important, seen. Jason remembered how clients once adored her at networking events because she remembered details nobody else cared enough to notice. The names of their children, favorite wines, stories mentioned casually months earlier. While Jason sold ambition, Eleanor made people feel human around it. Back then, he mistook emotional intelligence for weakness because it did not look powerful in the way he understood power. The memory drifted into another one before he could stop it. 3 years ago, late evening, rain against penthouse windows. Eleanor sitting alone at the kitchen island while her untouched dinner grew cold beneath pendant lighting. Jason had arrived home after midnight smelling faintly of expensive whiskey and Chloe's perfume. Eleanor knew before he said anything. Women always know before men realize they have become obvious. "Are you in love with her?" she asked quietly. Jason remembered loosening his tie without answering immediately. Irritation came first, not guilt, because somewhere deep inside himself, he had already justified everything. "I think we both know this marriage has not been working for a long time," he finally replied. Eleanor looked down at her hands after that. Not dramatic, not hysterical, just tired in a way he had never bothered understanding. "So that is a yes." Jason remembered feeling strangely relieved once the truth entered the room, as though honesty somehow erased cruelty. Chloe had represented excitement back then. Simplicity, a version of himself untouched by responsibility or emotional complexity. Young enough to admire him without questioning the cost of his ambition. The affair became public within months. Social media photos, weekend trips, industry parties. Jason convinced himself people envied him. Maybe some of them did. But others watched Eleanor disappear quietly from their shared world and assumed silence meant defeat. Nobody saw the nights she packed boxes alone while rain echoed through empty penthouse rooms. Nobody saw her sitting inside a tiny furnished apartment months later staring at divorce papers spread across a kitchen table too small for both her grief and dignity. Jason certainly never imagined it, because he thought Eleanor needed him more than she needed herself. "She looks happier now than when she was married to you," Chloe said suddenly, her eyes fixed across the ballroom. The words landed like ice water down Jason's spine. He turned sharply toward her. Chloe shrugged one shoulder, pretending indifference while adjusting the diamond bracelet around her wrist. "I am just saying." Jason opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words came. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Eleanor looked lighter now, not because life had been easy after him, but because survival had forced her to rebuild herself from the ground up without relying on anyone else's approval. Near the ballroom entrance, another burst of thunder rolled softly overhead. Eleanor glanced briefly toward the rain outside before smiling at something Jessica whispered beside her. The expression reached her eyes fully this time. Genuine, unforced. Jason felt his stomach tighten unexpectedly, because for years he told himself Eleanor would eventually regret losing him. Tonight, watching her glow beneath the chandelier light while the entire room quietly revolved around her presence, he faced a truth far more painful than regret. Eleanor Hayes had not been destroyed by losing Jason Carter. She had become extraordinary because she survived him. Long before Eleanor Hayes walked back into the Grandview ballroom wrapped in champagne silk and quiet confidence, there had been a winter where she could barely recognize the woman staring back at her from the bathroom mirror. After the divorce, Chicago felt unbearable. Every restaurant carried memories. Every street corner reminded her of a version of herself she no longer trusted. The penthouse was gone within weeks. Jason kept most of the furniture, claiming it belonged to the lifestyle he had built. Eleanor did not argue. By then, she was too emotionally exhausted to fight over marble countertops and designer chairs that never truly felt like home anyway. She rented a small apartment on the north side of Boston 6 months later after accepting freelance restoration work at a historic art gallery. The apartment sat above a narrow bookstore tucked between a coffee shop and a florist on a quiet brick street where rainwater collected in uneven sidewalks during storms. It was nothing like the life she had before. No floor-to-ceiling windows. No black SUVs waiting outside luxury hotels. Just creaking hardwood floors, old radiators, secondhand furniture, and silence. At first, the silence terrified her. She had spent so many years arranging her existence around Jason's schedule that she no longer remembered what her own life sounded like without him inside it. The first few months were brutal in small, humiliating ways nobody else saw. Eleanor cried in grocery store aisles because choosing dinner for one person felt unbearable. She avoided mirrors because she kept hearing Jason's voice inside her head every time she tried on clothes. Too plain, too emotional. too sensitive. Some nights, she fell asleep on the living room floor surrounded by unpacked boxes because finishing the apartment felt pointless when she could barely imagine a future inside it. But healing rarely arrives dramatically. Sometimes it begins quietly, through routine, through survival, through tiny acts of reclaiming yourself piece by piece. Eleanor started walking every morning before work through Boston Common, while cold air turned her cheeks pink beneath wool scarves. She drank coffee alone without apologizing for silence. She spent hours restoring damaged oil paintings beneath soft golden gallery lights, carefully repairing cracks in centuries-old canvases while slowly learning how to repair herself too. Her boss, Margaret Hollowell, was a silver-haired woman with sharp instincts and little patience for self-pity. "You apologize every time you enter a room," Margaret observed one evening while Eleanor cataloged inventory after closing. Eleanor looked startled. "I do not." "You do," Margaret replied calmly. "Women who spent years being diminished always do." The words stayed with Eleanor long after that conversation ended. Slowly, painfully, she began rebuilding her confidence in ways that had nothing to do with beauty or relationships. She learned contracts, investments, art acquisitions. Wealthy collectors from New York and Europe started requesting Eleanor specifically because of her extraordinary eye for restoration and historical detail. She stopped shrinking during conversations, stopped asking permission before expressing opinions, stopped measuring her worth through someone else's attention. The transformation was not sudden enough for social media. There were no dramatic revenge photos or public breakdowns. Most people from Chicago assumed Eleanor disappeared after the divorce because she stopped posting entirely. In reality, she had simply become too busy rebuilding a real life to perform one online. Across the ballroom tonight, Jason watched her laugh softly beside Jessica Monroe without understanding the years hidden beneath that composure. He saw elegance now, but he did not see the lonely winter mornings Eleanor spent eating soup beside a tiny apartment window while wondering whether she would ever feel whole again. He did not see the nights she worked until midnight restoring paintings because focusing on damaged art felt easier than confronting her own damaged heart. He did not see the therapy sessions, the panic attacks, the humiliating fear of running into old friends who only knew the glamorous version of her marriage. What Jason saw tonight was the final result, the polished version of survival. But what made Eleanor extraordinary was not the silk dress or the Rolls-Royce waiting outside in the rain. It was the simple fact that she rebuilt herself completely after someone she loved convinced her she was not enough. Near the ballroom stage, the jazz pianist shifted into a slower melody while candlelight flickered gently against crystal glasses. Eleanor brushed a loose strand of chestnut hair behind her ear while listening to Jessica speak, calm and radiant beneath the chandeliers. Jason stared at her from across the room and felt something twist painfully inside him. Because for the first time all evening, he was beginning to understand the true cost of losing her. The first time Eleanor Hayes met Sebastian Laurent, she was standing alone inside a private gallery in Boston at 7:30 on a snowy Thursday evening, carefully restoring the cracked edge of a 19th century landscape painting while the rest of the city rushed past outside in darkness. She remembered the sound before she noticed him. Slow footsteps against polished hardwood floors. Calm. Unhurried. Most wealthy collectors entered galleries loudly, wrapped in expensive cologne and self-importance. Sebastian Laurent did neither. He moved through the room quietly in a charcoal wool coat dusted with snowflakes, his attention lingering on the paintings instead of the people around them. Eleanor barely looked up at first. By then, she had learned to distrust powerful men with polished manners and tailored suits. "You repaired the brushwork on this piece," Sebastian said eventually, stopping beside the painting on her work table. His voice was low and steady, carrying the kind of confidence that never needed volume. Eleanor glanced up carefully. "Partially," she replied. "The original damage was severe. Most clients responded to technical explanations with polite disinterest. Sebastian did not. He studied the painting for another long moment before asking, 'How long did it take?' 3 months. That is a long time to spend saving something damaged." Eleanor paused slightly at the comment. "Some things deserve patience." A faint smile touched Sebastian's mouth then. Not flirtation. Recognition. As though he understood more from that sentence than she intended to reveal. Later, Margaret Hollowell pulled Eleanor aside near closing time and whispered, "Do you know who that was?" Eleanor shook her head. "Sebastian Laurent," Margaret said quietly. "Laurent Holdings." Even then, the name meant little to Eleanor. She was not the kind of person who tracked billionaire rankings or financial magazines. Only later did she discover Sebastian Laurent owned one of the largest international investment firms in the world, with interests spanning luxury hotels, art foundations, aviation, and private real estate across Europe and the United States. But what stayed with Eleanor was not his wealth. It was the way he looked at her work without trying to diminish her inside it. Weeks later, Sebastian returned to the gallery privately requesting Eleanor oversee restoration acquisitions for a new cultural foundation his company was funding in New York. The opportunity terrified her. During their marriage, Jason had spent years subtly convincing Eleanor she lacked the confidence for high-level business negotiations. "You are talented," he used to say carefully, "but you are not exactly built for corporate environments." Sebastian Laurent never spoke to her that way. During meetings, he listened fully when she explained restoration strategies, asked questions, trusted her judgment without making her earn basic respect first. Slowly, almost against her own expectations, Eleanor began stepping into rooms she once thought belonged only to people like Jason. Luxury auctions in Manhattan, private estate evaluations in Connecticut, museum partnerships in Europe. And through all of it, Sebastian remained calm and observant beside her, never trying to control the version of herself she became. "You apologize too much," he told her once during a late dinner after an auction event in Manhattan. Eleanor looked up from her glass of sparkling water. "I do not." Sebastian raised one eyebrow slightly. "You apologize to the waiter because your chair was difficult to move." Eleanor laughed softly before realizing he was serious. "Most women who survive disappointment spend years apologizing for existing," he added quietly. "You should stop doing that." No grand declaration followed moments like those. No dramatic romance. Their connection unfolded slowly through trust, respect, and long conversations inside quiet hotel lounges after charity events where Eleanor no longer felt invisible. Sebastian never treated her healing like something inconvenient or excessive. He simply made space for it without judgment. Across the Grandview Ballroom tonight, Jason Carter watched Eleanor speaking calmly with former classmates while thunder rolled faintly outside the rain-covered windows. He had no idea how many versions of herself she had rebuilt since leaving Chicago. And he certainly did not know that somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, the black Rolls-Royce waiting beneath the storm belonged not to a hired driver or rental service, but to Sebastian Laurent himself. Near the piano, Eleanor glanced briefly toward the ballroom entrance as though checking the time. A subtle movement, easy to miss, but Jason noticed it immediately, and for reasons he could not explain, unease settled slowly into his stomach the moment she smiled afterward. The rain outside the Grandview Country Club showed no sign of stopping. Water streamed down the tall ballroom windows in silver ribbons, while thunder rolled softly over the dark hills beyond the golf course. Inside, the reunion had settled into the comfortable exhaustion of expensive events that lasted too long. Jackets loosened. High heels slipped off beneath tables. Empty champagne glasses crowded silver trays near the bar. But beneath the warmth of candlelight and jazz music, tension still moved quietly through the room like static electricity. Especially around Jason Carter. He had stopped pretending not to notice Eleanor Hayes hours ago. Now he simply watched her openly whenever he thought nobody else was paying attention. Chloe noticed anyway. Of course she did. Women always noticed where attention drifted. "I am going to the restroom," she said coolly, setting down her champagne flute. Jason barely looked up. "Okay." Her expression tightened for half a second before she disappeared into the crowd. Across the ballroom, Eleanor stood near the piano while Jessica Monroe spoke animatedly beside her. Eleanor listened with one hand lightly wrapped around a crystal glass of sparkling water, the diamond bracelet at her wrist catching warm chandelier light each time she moved. Jason remembered buying Eleanor jewelry years ago during their marriage. Heavy pieces, flashy pieces, gifts chosen more to impress clients than suit her personality. She rarely wore them. Tonight, everything about her felt intentional, refined, effortless, as though she had finally become visible to herself after years spent disappearing for everyone else. The realization unsettled him more deeply with every passing minute. Before he could stop himself, Jason stood. Derek Holloway noticed immediately from the nearby bar and smirked into his bourbon glass. "Careful," Derek muttered as Jason passed. "Ghosts from the past tend to bite." Jason ignored him and crossed the ballroom slowly. The closer he got to Eleanor, the stranger his chest felt. Tight, unsteady, like his body recognized something his pride still refused to admit. Jessica spotted him first. Her expression cooled almost instantly. "Jason." "Jessica." Eleanor turned calmly at the sound of his voice. Up close, she looked even more breathtaking. Not younger, not artificially perfected, simply fully herself in a way she had never been during their marriage. Jason suddenly became aware of every careless word he had ever thrown at her over the years. "You look," he paused. The sentence he wanted to say felt impossible now. Happy, untouchable, magnificent. Instead, he settled for the safer lie. Different. Eleanor's lips curved slightly around the edge of her glass. Most people do after a decade. Jessica almost smiled at that. Jason shoved one hand into his pocket, searching desperately for the confidence that usually came so naturally to him. "I did not expect to see you tonight. I noticed." Eleanor's tone remained perfectly calm, but something inside the answer made his stomach tighten. Nearby, the jazz pianist shifted into a slower melody while candlelight flickered across polished marble floors. Around them, conversations continued, but Jason could feel people quietly paying attention. Watching. Waiting. "You disappeared after Boston," he said carefully. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "No, Jason. I just stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was." The words landed softly. No anger. No bitterness. Somehow that made them sharper. Jason swallowed hard. "That is not fair." Eleanor looked at him steadily for a long moment. "Fair," she repeated gently. "You introduced your affair partner on social media before our divorce papers were finalized." Jessica took a slow sip of champagne beside her, clearly enjoying Jason's discomfort now. His jaw tightened immediately. "Chloe and I did not plan things that way." Eleanor's expression never changed. "I know." That answer confused him more than anger would have. "You know?" She nodded once. "People reveal themselves long before they leave, Jason. I think part of me understood our marriage was ending months before you admitted it." For one unbearable second, neither of them spoke. The ballroom noise seemed distant suddenly, blurred beneath the soft rain hammering against the windows outside. Jason stared at Eleanor and realized she no longer looked wounded when discussing him. She looked healed. And healing was infinitely more terrifying than heartbreak because it meant she no longer needed anything from him at all. Then Eleanor glanced briefly toward the ballroom entrance again. This time, her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Softer, warmer. Jason followed her gaze instinctively, just as several hotel staff members near the front doors suddenly straightened their posture all at once. The shift near the ballroom entrance was subtle at first, the kind of movement most people would normally ignore. A hotel manager straightened his tie. Two staff members near the doors exchanged quick, nervous glances before immediately adjusting their posture. Even the bartender nearest the marble foyer paused mid-conversation and looked toward the entrance with sudden alertness. Jason Carter noticed all of it because Eleanor noticed it first, and the warmth that softened her expression in that moment struck him harder than anything else she had said all evening. It was not nostalgia, not politeness. It was affection, real affection. The ballroom doors opened slowly against the backdrop of rain and distant thunder. Cold air swept briefly across the marble floors, carrying the scent of wet pavement and winter storms. Then Sebastian Laurent stepped inside. He wore a charcoal-tailored overcoat over a midnight black suit that fit with quiet precision, the kind of elegance that did not advertise wealth because it existed far beyond needing approval. Rain glimmered faintly along his dark hair before one of the attendants hurried forward to take his coat. The reaction inside the ballroom happened almost instantly. Several older businessmen near the back straightened in recognition. One woman near the piano covered her mouth softly in disbelief. Even Derek Holloway muttered under his breath, "No way." Jason frowned immediately. The name had not reached him yet, but instinct tightened inside his chest anyway, because power recognized power long before introductions happened. Sebastian thanked the coat attendant quietly before his gaze moved through the ballroom with calm certainty. Then he saw Eleanor. And for the first time all evening, Jason witnessed someone look at Eleanor Hayes the exact way she deserved to be seen. Not as an accessory, not as a reflection of someone else's success, but as the center of the room itself. Sebastian crossed the ballroom slowly, completely unaffected by the whispers now spreading through the reunion like wildfire. That is Sebastian Laurent. Laurent Holdings? The Laurent family? What is he doing here? Chloe reappeared beside Jason just in time to hear the murmurs. Her eyes widened almost immediately. Jason, she whispered sharply. That's Sebastian Laurent? Jason's stomach dropped. Of course he knew the name. Everyone in real estate and investment circles knew the name. Laurent Holdings owned luxury hotels, private aviation firms, half a dozen landmark developments across Manhattan, and enough old money influence to make most wealthy men feel temporary. Jason suddenly remembered the black Rolls-Royce outside. The realization hit him all at once. Eleanor did not rent elegance tonight. She arrived with it. Sebastian stopped directly in front of Eleanor, and the tension in the ballroom became almost unbearable. Eleanor's entire expression softened when she looked at him. Not performative, not strategic, genuine. You made it, she said quietly. Sebastian's eyes lingered on her with unmistakable warmth. I said I would. Then, without hesitation, he reached gently for her hand and kissed her knuckles beneath the chandelier light. The entire room seemed to freeze. Jason felt his pulse stumble violently inside his chest. Chloe stared openly now, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Jessica Monroe folded her arms with visible satisfaction beside Eleanor. Sebastian finally turned toward the small, stunned circle around them. His expression remained calm, composed, impossible to intimidate. I apologize for arriving late, he said smoothly. Weather delayed our flight from New York. Flight. Jason caught that word instantly. Private jet. Of course. The reunion organizer suddenly hurried forward looking flustered and overeager all at once. Mr. Laurent, it is truly an honor to have you here tonight. Sebastian gave a polite nod before glancing toward Eleanor again. I was invited by Eleanor. The sentence was simple. Yet something about hearing Eleanor's name spoken with such effortless respect made Jason feel strangely small for the first time in years. Nearby, whispers exploded across the ballroom. Chloe slowly turned toward Jason with disbelief written across her face. You never told me your ex-wife was connected to Sebastian Laurent. Jason could not answer, because he was too busy staring at Eleanor. And Eleanor, standing beside one of the most powerful men in the country while rain hammered softly against the ballroom windows behind them, looked nothing like the broken woman he left behind years ago. She looked like someone who had stepped fully into a life bigger than anything he ever imagined for her. Then Sebastian placed a gentle hand against the small of Eleanor's back and asked softly, "Ready to leave whenever you are?" And for the first time all night, Jason Carter realized with complete horrifying clarity that he was no longer the most important man in Eleanor Hayes' story. The atmosphere inside the Grandview Ballroom transformed completely after Sebastian Laurent arrived. It no longer felt like a reunion. It felt like everyone had suddenly realized they had misunderstood the entire story all evening. Conversations fractured into whispers. Former classmates who barely acknowledged Eleanor earlier now watched her openly with fascination and disbelief. Even the staff moved differently around her now, more attentive, more careful, as though her presence beside Sebastian had revealed a level of importance nobody expected. Jason Carter stood frozen near the piano while Chloe remained silently beside him, her champagne untouched. For the first time since arriving tonight, Jason no longer looked like the center of the room. And he felt it, every second of it. Across the ballroom, Sebastian spoke briefly with the reunion organizer while Eleanor stood beside him with effortless calm. She did not cling to him for validation, did not perform excitement for the crowd. That alone revealed more about their relationship than public affection ever could. They looked like equals. Jason hated how much that realization unsettled him. You knew him this whole time? Chloe asked quietly without taking her eyes off Sebastian. Jason swallowed hard. No, then how does your ex-wife end up with someone like that? The question cut deeper than Chloe intended, because beneath it lived another question Jason could not stop hearing in his own head. How had he failed to see Eleanor's value before someone else recognized it immediately? Nearby, Derek Holloway approached slowly with visible amusement written across his face. Well, Derek muttered under his breath. This reunion just became a lot more interesting. Jason shot him a cold look. Derek raised both hands innocently before wandering back toward the bar. Across the room, Sebastian leaned slightly closer to Eleanor while she listened, her expression softening in a way Jason had not seen in years. There was no tension in her anymore. No cautiousness. No exhaustion hidden beneath forced smiles. Jason suddenly realized something painful. During their marriage, Eleanor spent years trying to earn emotional safety around him. With Sebastian, she already had it. The understanding hollowed out his chest. Before he could stop himself, Jason crossed the ballroom again. Chloe stared after him in disbelief, but did not follow this time. She already understood what the rest of the room understood now. Tonight was never really about her. Jason stopped a few feet from Eleanor and Sebastian, forcing composure back into his voice. "Eleanor," he said carefully. Sebastian turned politely while Eleanor met Jason's gaze without hesitation. Up close beside Sebastian, she seemed even more radiant somehow, not because of luxury, but because she no longer carried the invisible weight she used to drag through every room. Jason cleared his throat. "Could I speak with you for a second?" Sebastian glanced briefly toward Eleanor, silently leaving the decision entirely to her. That alone struck Jason harder than expected. No control, no possessiveness, just respect. Eleanor considered him for one quiet moment before nodding once. Briefly, they stepped toward the edge of the ballroom, near the rain-covered windows, while jazz music drifted softly behind them. Outside, the black Rolls-Royce still waited beneath the storm like something pulled from another world entirely. Jason shoved his hands into his pockets, suddenly unsure of himself in ways he had never experienced before. "I did not know," he admitted quietly. Eleanor looked out toward the rain. "Did not know what?" "That you would," he stopped. The sentence sounded pathetic before it fully formed. Eleanor finally turned toward him again. "That I would survive?" The words landed softly, but Jason flinched anyway. "That is not what I meant." "It should have been." Her tone never rose. That made every word sharper. Jason looked down briefly at the marble floor before speaking again. "I made mistakes." Eleanor gave a faint, almost sad smile. "You made choices, Jason." Silence stretched painfully between them while thunder rolled faintly overhead. Jason searched her face desperately for anger, bitterness, anything that still connected her emotionally to him. But Eleanor only looked peaceful now, whole, and that terrified him more than hatred ever could. "Did you do all this to prove something?" he asked quietly, glancing toward Sebastian, toward the ballroom, toward the version of Eleanor he no longer understood. Eleanor's expression softened almost imperceptibly then, not with love, but with pity. "No, Jason," she said gently. "I rebuilt my life because I finally realized my worth was never supposed to depend on whether you could see it." The sentence settled into him with devastating precision. Because deep down, Jason knew she was right. He had spent years reducing Eleanor into whatever version made him feel larger beside her. And now the woman he once treated as forgettable stood beneath chandelier light, beside one of the most respected men in the country, while he struggled just to hold eye contact with her. Near the ballroom entrance, Sebastian waited patiently without interrupting, his calm presence somehow making Jason feel even smaller. Eleanor glanced toward him once before looking back at Jason for the final time that night. "I hope you find whatever it is you are still chasing," she said quietly. Then she walked away from him without anger, without hesitation, without looking back. For several long seconds after Eleanor Hayes walked away, Jason Carter remained standing alone beside the rain-covered windows without moving. Around him, the reunion slowly resumed its noise again. Glasses clinked softly beneath chandelier light. Laughter drifted across the ballroom in uneven waves. The jazz pianist transitioned into another slow melody near the stage. But none of it reached him clearly anymore. His entire world had narrowed to the image of Eleanor standing beside Sebastian Laurent near the ballroom entrance, calm and radiant beneath the warm gold light, as though she had finally arrived exactly where she belonged. Chloe approached quietly from behind, her heels tapping lightly against the marble floor. "Jason." He did not answer immediately. Chloe folded her arms loosely, watching him with an expression that no longer carried jealousy. Only realization. "You still love her," she said softly. Jason let out a hollow laugh beneath his breath. "I do not even know if I ever deserved her." The honesty surprised both of them. Across the ballroom, Sebastian draped Eleanor's ivory cashmere coat carefully over her shoulders before saying something low enough that only she could hear. Eleanor smiled fully then. Not the careful social smile she used for strangers all evening. A real one, warm enough to soften her entire face. Jason felt the sight settle heavily inside his chest because he finally understood what had always been missing from his marriage. Eleanor had spent years loving him with her whole heart, while he measured relationships like business transactions. What improved his image? What fueled his ego? What made him feel successful? He thought admiration was the same thing as love. Standing there tonight, watching another man treasure the woman he once took for granted, Jason realized how wrong he had been. Nearby, Derek Holloway appeared again with a bourbon glass in hand. "Rough night?" he asked carefully. Jason stared toward the ballroom entrance where hotel staff now opened the doors against the storm outside. "I used to think winning meant everyone envying my life," Jason admitted quietly. Derek glanced toward Eleanor and Sebastian. "And now?" Jason swallowed hard. "Now I think I just spent years losing things that actually mattered." Derek said nothing after that, because there was nothing left to say. Across the room, Eleanor paused briefly before leaving and turned back one final time toward the ballroom. Her eyes swept calmly across the reunion that once represented so much pain and insecurity in her younger life. The classmates who underestimated her. The marriage that nearly erased her identity. The version of herself that once begged quietly to be loved correctly. All of it suddenly looked distant now. Small. She no longer carried bitterness toward any of it because bitterness required attachment, and Eleanor had already let go. Sebastian extended his hand toward her naturally. Eleanor took it without hesitation. Together, they stepped through the ballroom doors into the cold rain waiting outside. The storm wrapped instantly around the black Rolls-Royce parked beneath the covered entrance, rainwater gliding across its polished surface like liquid silver beneath the city lights. A driver hurried forward with an umbrella, but Sebastian gently waved him off before opening the passenger door for Eleanor himself. Inside the ballroom, several people moved closer to the windows to watch them leave. Jessica Monroe smiled quietly into her champagne glass. Chloe stood beside Jason in silence, suddenly aware that no amount of youth or beauty could compete with the kind of peace Eleanor now carried inside herself. Jason remained frozen near the piano while rain hammered softly against the glass. He watched Eleanor disappear into the warmth of the Rolls-Royce, her champagne silk dress glowing softly beneath the interior lights for one final moment before the door closed. Then Sebastian walked around the car and entered beside her. Seconds later, the engine purred smoothly to life. The Rolls-Royce pulled away from the Grandview Country Club slowly, headlights cutting through the storm while reflections of gold chandeliers shimmered across the wet pavement behind it. Jason kept staring long after the car disappeared beyond the gates. Because for the first time in his life, he understood the difference between possessing someone and truly valuing them. And by the time he finally learned that lesson, Eleanor Hayes no longer belonged to the version of the world where he could reach her. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the dark hills while rain washed the city clean beneath the night sky. Inside the ballroom, Jason Carter stood surrounded by everything he once believed mattered and realized none of it felt like enough anymore. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond the storm, Eleanor leaned back against soft leather seats beside a man who never asked her to become smaller in order to be loved. And as the city lights blurred gently beyond the rain-streaked windows, Eleanor finally allowed herself to breathe like a woman who had survived the worst thing that ever happened to her and discovered it was not the ending of her story after all. It was the beginning of her real life.